Ashi, if you shut that door, I'm gonna fucking... Now that I'm alone, I don't know if I should throw myself a party or under a bus. Anyways, welcome back to Aizawa Podfics. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 11 and 12 of Your Presence is a Dream in This Godforsaken Nightmare by Chaotic Bitch 033. This is going to be continuing from when... Oh my god, why is the background noise so loud? This is continuing from when Izuku used his quirk on Aizawa after getting the eye transplanted. So just a quick reminder so you don't have to go back and rewatch the whole thing, because I do that sometimes when it's been a long time since they posted the next part. Bruh. Oh my god. Hizashi, if you don't... Hizashi, I'm so done with you. Freaking starts doing laundry when I'm... Anyway, sorry for that long intro. Here's chapter 11, Touch of Hope. Summary. Izuku gets a little help from an unexpected place. The plan continues. The doctor ran tests for the next 3 hours. By the end of them, Izuku was covered in blood, sweat, vomit, and tears. He was also sporting several new burns. One of the guards apparently had a fire manipulation quirk. Izuku wasn't able to stop most of the attacks in time. He figured they wanted to test his control of erasure, see if it really bonded to his body or not. Izuku wasn't able to think about it much in between dodging streams of fire chasing him, unfortunately. Finally, when Izuku was seconds away from passing out, the doctor called in his 2 associates to clean Izuku up, per Overhaul's orders. A thick metal quirk-suppressing choker was clamped tightly around his neck, barely loose enough to breathe, before he was escorted to the baths. The entire process took much longer than it probably should have, but Izuku was stumbling with every step he took, and the 2 women had to be extra careful when cleaning his still exposed wounds. Izuku was bone-tired. Everything hurt. His eyes stung horribly, his head felt like it was being smashed open with a hammer, and he could barely move out of pure exhaustion. Funnily enough, the burns didn't hurt too badly. Bakugo's explosions hurt much, much worse. He didn't even have the strength to object when the 2 women, the same pair that had cleaned him in the first time, started to strip him of his clothing in the bathhouse. They had to peel off his shirt in pieces. The fabric stuck to his bloody skin. Izuku could only watch with half-lidded eyes as they began to wash his hair, working out all of the ash and soot that had compiled with gentle yet firm hands. They scrubbed his body and cleaned his wounds, eventually toweling him down and dressing him in warm cotton clothes. Izuku's eyelids grew heavier and heavier. His head started to droop as darkness comforted him at last. "You can't sleep yet, child." Izuku's eyes snapped open as he whipped his head upwards. He stared in disbelief at the 2 women. They had never actually spoken to him before. It was Kasuhoku, the one with brown hair, who had spoken. He was too tired to think, to say anything, so he looked on silently with his brows furrowed as the taller woman knelt gently in front of him. Akai was currently wrapping his arms in bandages, listening in silence as Kasuhoku continued. "You need to leave before Overhaul gets here tomorrow. If you don't, there's a good chance your hero will be killed." Izuku's breath caught in his throat. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why she was talking to him. She thought of Aizawa. The thought of Aizawa? He opened his mouth to question why, how, but Kasuhoku just shook her head furiously. "We don't have the time. Take this. It should help." She pressed a folded piece of paper into his hands, firmly tucking his fingers over it with care. Izuku couldn't help but notice how warm her touch was. He had more important things to worry about. He knew that. Maybe he was concussed or going insane. It reminded him of his mother. before everything went to shit. He looked deep into Kasoku's eyes, searching. Her dark brown irises held so much sorrow. He was filled with an intense and sudden urge to reach out, to hug her, to help her. He restrained himself, instead choosing to look at the paper in his hands. After unfolding it, it took him a second to comprehend what he was seeing. On the paper were a series of crudely drawn lines, squares, and rectangles, all arranged in various places. A closer look revealed tiny labels in small, neat handwriting. Izuku's heart stopped as he took in the words before him. Doctor's office, bath, main cell, garage, and so on. This was a map of the facilities. The tiredness Izuku had previously felt was long gone, adrenaline coursing through his veins almost violently. His eyes welled up with tears as he looked up at Kazuku's and Akai in shock. They met his gaze steadily, giving him mere looks of grim determination. "You have to go back to your cell now. We wish you luck, little hero." Akai spoke, her kind voice barely above a whisper. She'd been silent until now, and Izuku was surprised to see her eyes shining with unshed tears. Izuku took a deep breath, shaking his head vigorously. This was a goodbye, but there was so much he didn't know, so much he needed to understand. "No, what about you two? What's going to happen to you?" His voice broke with emotion as he looked back and forth between the two women, both of whom were now kneeling in front of him. "We'll be okay. We've been meaning to leave for a long, long time ago. When you escape, we'll run. Don't worry about us," Kazoku assured him, a sad smile on her face, but that didn't reach her eyes. "But I don't even know your names. Please, I can't." Someone banged on the door to the bathhouse, startling all three of them. 5 minutes to curfew," a gruff voice called from the hallway, sounding more tired than angry. It was guard number 2. Izuku was pretty sure. He had the lowest voices of all the guards, one that always scared Izuku shitless. "Thank you. We'll be right out, just finishing his bandages," Akai responded calmly, raising her voice so the man could hear her. Izuku looked at the two women with wide eyes, his breath coming faster and faster. He wanted to stay with them in the warm bathhouse, wanted to learn their names and talk to them and understand who they are and why they were in a place like this to begin with. Wanted to thank them and help them escape, but there was no time for any of that. They didn't have time. Izuku had so many things he wanted to say, so many ideas bubbling in the back of his mind, but couldn't find the words to express a single thing. So he reached forward, grabbing onto Akai's right hand and Kazoku's left with his own, bowing deeply with his head to the floor, tucked close against his knees. "Thank you," he managed to say, broken and tearful, but full of emotion, of gratitude and sorrow. It wasn't enough and would never be enough, but Izuku could only hope that it would get his message across. The two women just pulled him up, helping him onto his feet. Kazoku squeezed his hand briefly before letting it go, her eyes soft and gentle. Akai tucked the map back into his hands, offering him a smile. It was small and tinged with sadness, but it was beautiful. They fixed him with meaningful looks of sorrow and guilt and hope and love. He nodded at them, meeting their gazes directly, a heavy acknowledgement of everything that his words would never be able to express. His eyes flickered back to the paper clutched tightly in his hands. He folded it quickly, stuffing it into the waistband of his shorts and under the cover of his shirt. Kazoku and Akai exchanged a look between themselves, fleeting and determined, before guiding Izuku to the entrance of the bathroom. They looked at Izuku once more, a silent question of, "Are you ready?" floating in the air. Izuku nodded again, taking a deep breath as Akai opened the door and alerted the guard that they were done. As he was being dragged back to his cell, he forced himself not to look backwards, but he wanted to. He really wanted to. He thought of the map tucked away in his waistband. The stinging of his burns and the ache behind his eyes fell to the background. He could barely feel them beneath the pounding of his heart. the racing of his blood in his veins. This was their ticket out of here. They were going to get out. Izuku didn't even feel irritated at the guard's bruising grip on his arm, or the way he unceremoniously threw him into his cell, locking the door behind him. Because for the first time since he had been kidnapped, hell, even long before then, Izuku felt alive. When Aizawa heard footsteps approaching the cell and saw the body of Izuku thrown harshly to the ground in front of him, he was expecting the worst. He expected the boy to be bloody and beaten, unconscious, or about to be, in the middle of a massive breakdown. The list went on. What he did not expect, however, was the absolutely blinding smile that faced him when Izuku pulled himself off the ground almost immediately. He didn't expect Izuku to run forward and launch himself into his arms, laughing freely and joyfully as if they were out at the park instead of in a dark prison cell. It was safe to say that Aizawa Shoda was very, very confused, but he just stood there, awkwardly supporting the weight of Izuku's body as the kid squeezed him in a vise-like grip, still laughing. "Kid, what the hell?" Aizawa balked, searching Izuku carefully for a head injury. He was covered in bandages, some spots bloody but mostly white. But nothing that should cause behavior like this. Maybe he had been drugged, or had a concussion, or... Izuku removed himself from Aizawa's arms, standing in front of him as he bounced on his toes excitedly. He looked up with wide, enthusiastic eyes. Aizawa met his gaze, ready to search his pupils for signs of trauma when he was met with his own eyes staring back at him. Aizawa inhaled sharply, trying to control his expression so as to not startle Izuku, but he couldn't hide his shock quickly enough. Izuku's excitement dulled significantly, replaced first with confusion before darkening in realization. He looked down to the floor, face scrunched as if he were about to cry. It was the first time they had seen each other since the operation, since they had been tortured, experimented on, since Izuku had gotten Aizawa's eye. They stood like that for a moment in silence. Aizawa knew he should say something, anything, but he really didn't know where to even start. Izuku beat him to it. I'm sorry, Aizawa. I'm so sorry." Izuku's voice cracked with emotion, sorrow and guilt evident in his tone. Aizawa immediately interjected. "Kid, it's not your fault. Not at all. You got that?" He used his teacher's voice, the one that left no room for arguments. Izuku hesitantly nodded, sniffling and wiping his nose with the back of his hand. In all his years of being a hero, nothing had prepared him for a situation quite like this. Another awkward moment of silence permeated the room before Aizawa spoke up again. "Now, what made you so goddamn happy just a minute ago? I can't imagine they took you out for ice cream or something." His voice was laced with sarcasm, but the underlying concern and confusion was still there. Upon the shift in topic, Izuku's face lit up, though not as brightly as before. The kid reached into his waistband of his shorts, pulling out a folded piece of paper, which he quickly handed to Aizawa. The hero gave him a questioning look, but Izuku only nodded in encouragement. With a sigh, Izuku unfolded the paper to reveal a map, a full labeled map of the facilities. His mouth dropped open in surprise, a feat for the usually stoic man. "What is this real? Where did you get this?" Aizawa's eye was open now, hope flickering in his chest. He looked back to Izuku, questioning. "We should probably sit down. I'll tell you everything." And so, the two sat on Aizawa's flimsy mattress on the floor, and Izuku explained, through sign language, just to be cautious, what had gone over the past few hours. He explained how Overhaul had made an appearance, and he had managed to activate Erasure. He wouldn't meet Aizawa's gaze when he signed about using the quirk. Moving quickly on to explaining his training with the doctor, Aizawa had to control his rising anger carefully, gritting his teeth and breathing deeply through his nose while Izuku described what those monsters had put him through. He forced himself to sit patiently while his kids signed, eventually describing his interaction with the doctor's associates. When he finished, the room's quiet seemed to grow even more tense. Aizawa took a moment to dissect all of that. He was still processing losing his eye. The pain was a constant reminder, aching with every beat of his heart. Still processing the fact that Izuku now apparently shared Aizawa's quirk, or maybe it was gone. Maybe they had taken it from Aizawa completely and given it to Izuku. But that didn't feel right. He could still feel his quirk in his body. It was just muffled. It was definitely still there, but with the quirk suppressor back in his shoulder, it was hard to tell if he'd still be able to use it or not. It was hard to tell if he'd still be able to use it, or if it was as strong as it had been before. Shaking his head furiously, ignoring the dizziness that came from the action, Aizawa tried to clear his thoughts. He couldn't dwell on his quirk right now. He had to focus on Izuku, on moving forward, on the plan. They were practically handed the key to their escape. Aizawa scrutinized the map carefully. At first, he thought it was a sick joke, some psychological torture designed to fuck with their emotions or something, but looking at the map, it matched up perfectly with the parts of the facility that Aizawa had seen so far. Plus, it was an overhaul style. If he wanted to torture them, he'd just use his quirk. Giving them a fake map would just be a waste of time. So if the map was real, then that meant they had a chance. After a few minutes of thinking, Aizawa's calculating gaze met Izuku's, and he grinned. Izuku's eyes widened in shock at his smile, growing even wider as Aizawa reached into the sleeve of his shirt and pulled out the scalpel he had taken from the doctor's office. Izuku's mouth dropped open, closing briefly before opening again. The kid was like a fish out of water. He looked back and forth between the scalpel and Aizawa, blinking as if trying to understand what he was seeing. "Looks like it's our time to leave, kiddo." At those words, Izuku's face crumbled, his eyes shining with tears, glinting with hope. He carefully removed the scalpel from Aizawa's grip, setting it on the ground safely before launching himself into his hero's arms for the second time that night. The pair held each other tightly, staying like that for quite some time. If tears were shed by the hero and his kid, well, no one would be any wiser. Izuku and Aizawa, after emotionally processing everything, got to planning. They both committed the map to memory, and Aizawa taught Izuku the very basics on how to wield a knife without getting hurt, or in this case, a scalpel. Aizawa didn't plan on Izuku needing the skill anytime soon, but he wanted to be prepared. Once the quick lesson was out of the way, and the pair had the map practically imprinted in their brains, they talked strategy. "I'm going to take the lead on things," Aizawa signed, making sure that Izuku understood. "I want you to follow me and be prepared to run if things go to shit. Well, I know you can handle yourself. I'm not going to risk it if I don't have to." Izuku nodded hesitantly, his lips pursed and his brows furrowed. But if you're in more danger than I am after today. But you're in more danger than I am after today." "What do you mean?" Looking troubled, Izuku elaborated. "Oh. Sorry, I read that completely wrong." Izuku nodded hesitantly, his lips pursed and his brows furrowed. But you're in more danger than I am after today." "What do you mean?" Looking troubled, Izuku elaborated. "They needed you for your quirk. Now that I have your eye, they don't need you anymore. If things go bad, they're not going to kill me, only as a last resort. They still need me. If they can give me a quirk, a working quirk, and then remove it, then their experiments will be complete. I'm just scared about you, that's all." Aizawa thought about that for a moment. Izuku wasn't wrong, necessarily. Out of the two of them, Aizawa was by far more expendable in their eyes. Still, there are quirkless people in the world. They won't hesitate to kill you if it comes down to it. Don't make any stupid moves, okay? "Zala, I think there's something you need to know. I don't think I'm the quirkless one. I mean, I'm oh fuck, I'm so sorry. My game is so off. Zawa, I think there's something you should know. I don't think I'm the only quirkless one. I mean, I am now, but I think I'm the only one left alive. I think there were more before me. Izuku looked at Aizawa, his dark eyes and his hands shaking. If what Izuku said was true, then no, he couldn't get sucked into that line of thought. He had to focus. We'll worry about that later. Right now, we have to make a plan. Just remember to be careful. Aizawa gave Izuku a meaningful look, trying to get through to him. Okay. Trying not to think too hard about all that. They continued on to making the actual plan. The first obstacle standing in their way was getting out of the cell and past all of the guards. They talked for a bit about how to actually do this. They considered waiting until the doctor needed them for another examination to play the long game, but that was too risky. Eventually, they decided it was the best to get one of the guards to open their cell, knock him unconscious, and make a break for it. As for how to actually get a guard to open the door for them, that was still being figured out. Izuku suggested repeating what he had did last time, banging on the door and screaming, but Aizawa wasn't sure the guards would fall for that again. Aizawa thought about it for a little, trying to isolate a weakness, something the doctor in overhaul wouldn't take any chances on. He looked at Izuku, his gaze moving from the kid's quirk-suppressing collar to his mismatched eyes. Now, that could just work. After ironing out the details, Izuku and Aizawa decided on having Izuku fake a medical problem, like a seizure or heart attack. Logically, the guards should be on high alert because they're still looking out for any side effects from the new quirk. Both of them winced at that, but it meant that they'll rush in to make sure everything was okay. Hypothetically, at least, the guard, or guards if they were unlucky, would open the cell door, and Aizawa would ambush them while they were distracted with Izuku. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had for now. The general escape route was easy to make with the help of the map. If they just could make it to the garage. Aizawa was sure that they could find some sort of transportation to drive to safety. After all, a facility this big had to have vehicles to transport staff, materials, resources, etc. Izuku piped up, offering his ability to hotwire cars in case they couldn't find any keys, which was helpful, but a little concerning. Aizawa didn't ask how he had learned that. He was incredibly curious, but he couldn't afford to lose focus right now. They had a decent plan, but it wasn't done yet. Aizawa decided it was time to rip the band-aid off and bring up the topic they had both had been avoiding. We need to plan for overhaul. Aizawa watched Izuku's face carefully once he finished signing. The boy's eyes darkened, and he looked to the ground, clenching and unclenching his fist tightly. The kid was smart. He knew that Aizawa was going to ask him to do what Aizawa was going to ask him to do. His eyes flicked over to the scalpel lying on the stone floor, only a few feet away from the pair. You could cut off one of his fingers or something. He needs his hands to use his quirk. And I think it's a 5-point activation. Maybe break his arms or target his eyes so he can't see to use his quirk in the first place. The longer Izuku went on, the more grateful Aizawa was to be on the kid's side. He really hoped he could keep Izuku away from Nezu, because if the two ever met, he was sure they'd be able to accomplish world domination. Aizawa took a deep breath, choosing to speak instead of signing this time, interrupting Izuku's rant. Kid, you know I don't stand a chance against him without my quirk. Izuku seemed to curl into himself at those words, drawing his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around them tightly. The doctor replaced my quirk The doctor replaced my quirk suppressor implant. I need to get it out. I need your help with that. It's too close to one of my carotid arteries for me to take out alone. Listen, I know it's not ideal. Zawa, I can't. Aizawa persisted, trying to calm Izuku down. I'll be guiding you through it the entire time. I promise you won't be hurting me, kid. It's scary, but... Scary? This is your life. You can't seriously expect me to cut into your neck with a fucking scalpel. I could kill you. I'm not doing it. I won't do it. Izuku's tone was desperate, his chest heaving. Aizawa took a step forward, his hands raised, pleading. Izuku, we don't have a choice. We can't be Overhaul without my quirk. It has to be done. Izuku clutched his head in his hands, pulling at his hair as he muttered something, too quiet for Aizawa to hear. Aizawa was getting worried now, almost frantic. If Izuku wouldn't remove the suppressor, there was no way he'd be able to win against Overhaul. He had to protect the kid, had to make sure that Izuku made it out of this alive. Kid, please. Aizawa reached forward, putting a hand on Izuku's shoulder, when Izuku's head snapped upwards, his eyes a blazing crimson, his hair floating around his head. Stop it! Izuku's teeth were bared in a snarl, his gaze wide and unfocused. He glared at Aizawa as if he were an enemy, as if he were the doctor or Overhaul. The thought had Aizawa struggling to breathe, recoiling his hand from Izuku's shoulder quickly, his stomach churned with guilt. He had pushed Izuku too far. That much was clear. With his intelligence and maturity, it was too easy to treat him as if he was older. But Izuku was a child, one who had undergone too much emotional and physical torture to be fully stable. Triggers, panic attacks, PTSD, dissociation, textbook outcomes of any trauma, let alone torture like this. Aizawa should have known better. He should have seen the warning signs at the beginning of the conversation. He cursed himself, stuffing down his own emotions as he tried to focus on the situation at hand. Aizawa moved to back away, to give the kid some space, but Izuku flinched at the motion, flinging himself against the wall behind him and slamming his fist against the stone as if trying to break through it, sobbing as he hit the wall again and again and again. Jumping into action, Aizawa wrapped his arms around Izuku so he couldn't hurt himself anymore, gritting his teeth as the kid clawed and scratched and tried to push Aizawa away. It's okay, kid. You're safe. Izuku, you're safe, he assured Izuku through his cries, trying to contain any damage to himself rather than his kid. It took a few minutes for Izuku to tire, eventually relaxing into Aizawa's hold as he trembled uncontrollably, now silent, still dazed and non-responding. The sight had Aizawa blinking away tears. He had triggered something, had made his kid scared and angry and panicked, and... Zawa? Izuku blinked a few times, hands squeezing Aizawa's arms. Aizawa pulled back quickly, keeping his hands on Izuku's shoulders as he researched for the kid's face for any fear, any anger. All he found was confusion. Izuku looked down to Aizawa's hands, eyes widening at the reddening scratches littering his skin, disappearing under his sleeve. Upon closer inspection, some were even on the man's face. Did I do that? Izuku gasped, pulling up Aizawa's sleeves frantically to see the extent of the marks. He looked back up at Aizawa, brows furrowed and mouth agape. Did I activate erasure? Aizawa hesitated for a moment, not wanting to upset Izuku any more than he had already. It was all the confirmation that Izuku needed. I'm so sorry. I didn't. I thought. I swear. I thought I wasn't trying to hurt you. I'm so sorry. Izuku was crying now, scrambling backwards in an attempt to put distance between himself and Aizawa. The hero just pulled the shaken kid into another hug, as gently as he could manage. Hey, kid. It's okay. Shh. It's okay. You didn't do anything wrong. It was my fault. It was all my fault. Aizawa's voice broke slightly before he managed to get it under control, his fingers brushing through Izuku's hair idly. They sat there for a while, Aizawa holding Izuku as the boy cried into his pleas of, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," died out. The kid was still trembling, but not as violently as he had been before. Aizawa promised himself to do better, to be better. He was a hero, for fuck's sake. He needed to act like one. Izuku finally pulled away, giving Aizawa a serious look. I'll do it, just not right now. My hands, they aren't steady enough." "Of course. Thank you, kid." Aizawa's voice was heavy with gratitude and guilt. He wished it didn't have to come to this. The kid didn't deserve any of this. The room fell silent, thick with anxiety, with dread. Or maybe that was just Aizawa's headspace, honestly. He couldn't tell at this point. "Hey, Zawa," Izuku mumbled after a moment, his expression changing suddenly. Aizawa hummed to show he was listening, gaze flickering up to Izuku's thoughtful face. I just activated Erasure with a quirk suppressant cuff on." Izuku's voice was quiet, his tone level, as if he wasn't fully aware of the magnitude of that statement. It quickly caught up to him. I just activated Erasure with a quirk suppressant cuff on." He turned to look at Aizawa with bright eyes, meeting the hero's equally amazed gaze. They shared a look for a brief moment, processing the implications of that. Aizawa was the first to break the silence, amusement evident in his tone. "Well, shit." Izuku just grinned, obviously coming to the same conclusion as Aizawa. Beating Overhaul without Erasure was near impossible. Even with one Erasure user, stealing the win would be hard. But with two of them, Overhaul was going down. Chapter 12. Time to go. Summary. Izuku and Aizawa make a run for it. Neither Aizawa nor Izuku slept that night. After finalizing their escape plan and discussing the last of the details, Izuku was eventually stable enough to remove Aizawa's quirk suppressor. Dozens of apologies and a few breakdowns later, the suppressor was out. As Izuku wrapped Aizawa's shoulders with a part of one of their torn blankets, hands shaking, Aizawa activated his quirk for the first time since his eye was taken. Eraser surged through him with a warm familiarity, and the anxiety gnawing a hole in Aizawa's chest dissipated. He was worried that without both of his eyes, his quirk function would be severely affected, but that didn't seem to be the case. He could feel the ache of his empty eye socket whether he used his quirk now. And he didn't think he could use Eraser for quite as long, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. He was still getting used to his changed depth perception. Moving and fighting proved to be rather difficult with only one eye, accompanied by random spells of dizziness and nausea. But he was making it work. He didn't have a choice, really. Izuku was still learning how to actually use Erasure, which Aizawa had given him some quick tips for. It was weird, to say the least. Neither of the two acknowledged the horrifying reality of that whole situation. They didn't have the luxury to do that right now. Aizawa did, however. Wonder how the kid was able to use Eraser with the quirk-suppressing collar still tight around his neck. Izuku had mumbled something about quirk factors and electromagnetic waves, but Aizawa stopped trying to understand after Izuku brought up something called a Bose-Einstein condensate. He could think about all of that later. He had more important things to worry about. More important things being Phase 1 of their plan. Phase 1, as Aizawa had named it, consisted of 3 main steps. 1. Attract the guards' attention. Force them to enter the cell. 2. While Izuku distracts the guards, Aizawa jumps on them and knocks them out. 3. Leave the cell and proceed to Phase 2. It sounded much simpler than it really was. In actuality, the number of things that could go wrong were staggering. But Izuku and Aizawa chose to ignore that little fact in favor of proceeding with the plan. Aizawa met Izuku's gaze with a serious expression, standing in front of him near the cell's door. The boy stared back, determination glinting in his eyes. The sight was both reassuring and absolutely terrifying. The Izuku before him was so very different from the child that Aizawa had met. However, many months prior, Aizawa realized with a start that Izuku didn't look like a child anymore. He had seen too much, had lived too much to be considered a child. The thought made Aizawa's chest tighten uncomfortably. He wondered when he had stopped seeing Izuku as a defenseless kid and had started seeing him as a trusted ally. Over the months of intense physical training, countless torture sessions, the eternity of sleepless nights, somewhere in the midst of all the chaos, Izuku had become someone Aizawa depended on, someone he trusted with his life, someone he cared about, like a son. A warm hand rested on his shoulder, and Aizawa was pulled out of his thoughts. He raised his head, once again meeting heterochromatic eyes, darkened with worry. Aizawa? Izuku's voice was hesitant, wary of a future neither of them could guarantee. The sound of his name was enough to bring himself back to the present. He took a deep breath. Now wasn't the time to get caught up in his thoughts. He gave Izuku the steadiest nod he could before reaching out to place his hand on the boy's head, ruffling his hair gently. "It'll be okay, kid. We'll be okay." His voice was softer than usual, trying to convey feelings of reassurance. Aizawa wasn't sure it worked, but his kid just nodded back at him, gaze heavy with resolve, as he moved to his position. Aizawa took another deep breath. It was now or never. Hiding the stolen scalpel up his sleeve, the underground hero approached the heavy metal door of the cell. Izuku, closer to the middle of the room, lay on the stone floor, preparing for the guard's presence. Once Aizawa was sure that Izuku was ready, he drew back his closed fist and banged harshly against the cold surface, yelling out, "Someone, come quick! You bastards fucked him up with my quirk. He's not fucking breathing. I swear I'll murder every one of you if my kid dies. I'll rip your fucking throats out. He's not fucking breathing." It didn't take long until Aizawa's frantic cries were cut off by the rushed clanging of locks opening. He was quick to jump to the side, narrowly avoiding the swing of the door as guard number 1 ran in, panic evident on his face. He apparently had some brain power as he shut the cell door behind him, but his intelligence ran out when he chose to ignore Aizawa in favor of checking on Izuku. Izuku, who was currently convulsing on the floor, clutching his throat and gasping for air. If Aizawa hadn't already known it was fake, he would have rushed to give the kid medical attention. Tucking his appreciation for Izuku's acting skills in the back of his mind, he lunged at the guard's exposed neck, slamming his elbow into the man's Adam's apple and rendering him breathless before quickly twisting his body and delivering another blow, this time to the guard's temple. The man hadn't even had time to cry out before he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Aizawa was just glad it was quick. He really hadn't wanted to use the scalpel, not in front of Izuku. After confirmation that the guard was down for the count, Aizawa quickly searched his person for anything he could use in his favor. He found a taser, a walkie-talkie, the keys to the cell, and an ID card, all secured to a utility belt strapped around the man's waist. The lack of any type of firearm was odd, but Aizawa supposed that the guards were able to win most fights through brutal strength alone. Stripping the guard of his belt and its accessories, Aizawa secured the scalpel into one of the empty pockets after tightening the belt around his own waist. He also took the man's shoes off, ignoring the strange look that Aizawa gave him as he put them on. They were a little bit too big to fit him properly, and they smelled like absolute shit, but they were better than nothing. He wanted to give Izuku the shoes instead, but they would have only fallen off the kid's feet. The thought might have been funny if they weren't in a life or death situation. With the guard still unconscious and his possessions now added to Aizawa's collection, they were ready to move on. Making sure that Izuku was close behind him, Aizawa cracked the door to the cell open slowly. peeking his head out to search for any unwelcome visitors. An empty hallway stretched before him, silence and looming. Aizawa beckoned to Izuku, ushering him out of the cell and locking the door behind him as quietly as possible. Tucking the keys back into the belt, he met Izuku's gaze, his pulse racing against his throat, and nodded. It was time for Phase 2. All things considered, Phase 2 was simple. Make it to the garage without dying. Izuku and Aizawa had spent hours making detailed plans on what to do for any and every roadblock they may encounter on the way. But Aizawa thought that making it to the garage without dying captured all of those plans rather nicely. If anything were to go horribly wrong, it would be in this place. They were essentially going in blind. They had no idea where the doctor or overhaul were, didn't know if the facility had more faculty or guards that they weren't prepared for, didn't know the extent of the security measures taken. There were a lot of unknowns and very few certainties, but it was their only chance, and they had to take it. If they didn't, well, there wouldn't be another opportunity. Of that, Aizawa was sure. Keeping that pleasant thought in the back of his mind, Aizawa led Izuku down the hallway, outside of the cell, keeping close to the walls and never standing still for more than a second. He had long since taught Izuku how to walk without making any noise. The key is to step with your toes first, then your heels. So the pair were being rather sneaky if you ignore the fact that the hallways were illuminated with bright, luminescent lights that left them in plain sight if anyone were to come across them. They made their way down this hallway before taking a right into the next. Aizawa mentally tracking the upcoming route. 2 hallways down, 4 more to go. After that, they would pass the doctor's office, another 3 hallways, and hopefully reach the garage in one piece. Aizawa stuffed down the nausea swimming in his stomach, clenching his teeth as they surrounded another corner. They were doing it. He was going to get Izuku the fuck out of here. All they had to do was stay undetected. If they stayed undetected, then everything was going to be okay, and Aizawa froze in place, reaching out a hand to stop Izuku behind him. The kid looked at him, confused, but Aizawa just shook his head. The hallway was eerily silent, but just barely. Aizawa could hear the telltale scuffling of footsteps coming right towards them. Aizawa and Izuku made a quick eye contact, exchanging a terse nod before getting into position. They had planned for the situation, for someone to find them while they were escaping. They couldn't hide, since the hallways had no accessible vents or closets, so they chose to attack first. The 2 had very little going for them, but they did have the element of surprise. The footsteps were even louder now. Aizawa's mind raced, trying to focus on the approaching noise. Footsteps too light to be over 200 pounds, too careless to be overhaul, not frantic or rushed, which means no one had found the guard's body yet, and as the figure turned the corner, he jumped into action, darting forward. Aizawa swung his right leg in a sweeping arc, headed towards the doctor's, Aizawa noted bitterly, head. His foot, now armed with steel-toed boots, courtesy of guard number 1, slammed into the doctor's skull, throwing him into the wall, face first. The man cried out in pain, a crack echoing throughout the hallway as blood began streaming from his nose. He scrambled to right himself as his eyes widened in confusion, darting from Aizawa's steadying figure to Izuku's. How did you? The doctor tried to ask, his voice nasally and strangled. But Izuku was already springing into action, moving in tandem with Aizawa, who jumped back, just as they had practiced. Aizawa wasn't able to knock someone out on the first try. Izuku lunged toward the man in front of him, pulling his elbow back and smashing it into his temple. A devastating blow that had the doctor crumbling to the floor. The arm that had been reached for a walkie-talkie, now limp against the ground. The whole exchange hadn't lasted more than a minute. Aizawa and Izuku took a second to catch their breath, standing above the unmoving figure of the man, who had tortured them without mercy for months. If Aizawa had his way, he'd gladly see the bastard rot in Tartarus for the rest of his life, but he settled on restraining the doctor with his own bunched-up lab coat, choosing not to reprimand Izuku for aiming a kick at the man's gut. He may have even slipped in a kick of his own, maybe even two. Who was really counting anyways? Aizawa had to force himself to keep moving, leaving the unconscious doctor behind him as he steered Izuku onwards, faster than before. It was only a matter of time until someone found the doctor's body, and they needed to be long gone when that happened. Another right turn, down a hallway, left, past the doctor's office, more hallways, right. Aizawa's chest tightened, and he forced himself to breathe. They were getting close to the garage, and the panic was starting to settle in now. The crippling fear of failure looming over his shoulders, he glanced behind him briefly, taking in Izuku's determined expression. The beads of sweat dripping down the boy's face. He grit his teeth, focusing on the path ahead of them. They were going to get out of this place. He was going to get Izuku to safety. So far, everything was actually going to plan, much to his surprise. Aizawa led Izuku past another turn, the fluorescent lights flickering above them. The facility was quiet, almost calm. He could just barely hear Izuku breathing behind him, the warmth of his body close to Aizawa's back. It was a comforting presence, one that helped keep the hero grounded, helped to pacify his anxiety, if only a little. Just a few hallways left, and then a screeching alarm blared throughout the building, red lights flashing on the corner of every wall. Alarmed voices cried out in the distance, the sound of pounding footsteps echoing down a nearby hallway. Aizawa swore, turning around and grabbing Izuku by the shoulders in a quick moment of reassurance, his gaze trying to convey something that he couldn't put to words. Izuku just stared back, his eyes wide and scared, so terribly scared. But he placed his hands over Aizawa's and held them tightly. His mouth pursed as he nodded. They had planned for this. They were going to be okay. They would make it out. They had to. The two broke eye contact as the footsteps rounded the corner at the end of the hallway ahead of them, leaving them no chance for getting the element of surprise this time. Both Izuku and Aizawa dropped into a fighting stance. Aizawa had tried to step in front of Izuku as best as he could, but he knew it wouldn't help much. His heart dropped at the sight ahead of him. The other two guards were racing towards him, imposing and furious, Baitons at the ready. If the crackling of their walkie-talkies were any indication, it sounded like there were more henchmen on their way. It wasn't looking good, to say the least. That didn't stop Aizawa and Izuku from meeting the guards head-on. However, as Izuku lured guard number 2 further down the hallway, dodging his Baiton attacks like a fucking rabbit, the kid was incredible, Aizawa faced guard number 3. His plan was to incapacitate the man as quickly as possible so he could reach to Izuku's aid, which unfortunately was easier said than done. The guard was over 6'5", with the body of a pro wrestler, and Aizawa had spent the past few months being tortured, malnourished, and without the intensive training he had grown accustomed to as an underground hero. To add to that clusterfuck, they were in a goddamn hallway, which meant that Aizawa didn't have the room to make any mistakes. He barely had the room to dodge the wild swings of the man's Baiton, for fuck's sake. Aizawa ducked under the guard's Baiton, darting around in behind him before kicking out his knee, forcing him to the ground. Before he could get back up, Aizawa jumped on his back, wrapping his elbow around the man's throat and holding on tight. It was a move he would never use on the field, but Aizawa was getting desperate. All he wanted to do was knock the bitch out. He wasn't going to kill him, not if he didn't have to. But even as the guard gasped for air, he grabbed the Baiton, clattering to the floor. The man was strong. He grabbed Aizawa's elbow, trying to force it to unclasp, but before reaching up to the hero's wrist and squeezing, he could feel his wrist shatter before hearing the crack. Gritting his teeth to stop himself from crying out, Aizawa pressed down harder on the man's throat, but his grip was weaker now, unstable. Panic surged through his body as he racked his brain for something, anything. With his left hand, He back. He scrambled to grab the scalpel out of his utility belt, bracing himself as he drew back his arm and plunged the blade into the guard's left eye. Drops of blood splattered on his hand. His wrist. The man screamed, releasing his hold on Aizawa in favor of clutching his face, his eye. Aizawa didn't take the moment for granted. He jumped off of the guard's back and rolled into a dismount, putting what little distance he could between them. His wrist ached, deep and intense, and his vision blurred for just a moment as he reached back into the belt around his waist. The taser. He could use the taser. Aizawa pulled the weapon out, ready to electrocute the half-blind piece of shit, still on the ground, consumed with agony, when the hallway grew brighter, hotter. An absolutely gut-wrenching scream tore through the air behind him. Izuku whipped around, only to see a stream of churning fire right where Izuku had been fighting. Izuku had warned him about the guard with the fire manipulation quirk, but he had been so panicked that he had forgotten, and now Aizawa activated his quirk on instinct, his hair flying around his face as he howled, "Izuku!" The flames died out, and Aizawa saw his kid, trying to maintain a fighting stance, but stumbling, dropping to one knee, now covered in burns. Aizawa could hear the guard behind him stir, but guard number 2 was still approaching Izuku, and the kid had no way to fight back, nothing to attack him with. He needed to save his kid. He was going to save his kid. Aizawa rushed forwards, throwing himself between Izuku and the guard, tasing the bastard while Erasure was still activated, so he couldn't use his quirk. The man fell to the ground in a heap, convulsing as electricity surged through his body. Aizawa's eyes burned, and his wrists were screaming at him, but he didn't have time to rest because the guard he had stabbed in the eye was back on his feet, running in his direction with blood pouring down his face. In his panic to help Izuku, Aizawa had left himself completely open. Something hit his abdomen, sharp and stinging, followed by a crushing blow to his leg. He let out a strangled cry of pain, taken aback by the sudden procession of attacks. His head swam, bile tearing its way up his throat. He had to get it together. The guard was rearing up to attack again, his gaze wild and mouth open in a snarl, and Aizawa swept out his left leg, the one that hadn't been hit, as high as he could, desperate to just get the man away from him, away from Izuku. By some miracle, Aizawa's foot slammed against the guard's head on the same side as the injury he had previously inflicted, clipping the open wound while his ear took the brunt of the hit. The guard stumbled backwards, falling onto his back with a cry of pain. Writhing on the ground before he could even try to get back up, Aizawa staggered forwards, drawing back his elbow and brushing it into the guard's temple only when the man's massive fingers stopped moving. Still breathing, Aizawa reassured himself, did the hero allow himself a moment to breathe. He took a shuddering breath, his lungs straining with the action. Blinking a few times, Aizawa tried to rid his vision of the black dots surrounding his peripheral. "Zawa?" Izuku called out from the other end of the hallway, tripping as he tried to get to Aizawa. He was alive. Aizawa slumped in relief. His kid was alive. As Izuku approached, his face seemed to twist in horror, eyes locking on Izuku's stomach. Aizawa furrowed his brows, looking down at the handle of the scalpel sticking out of his gut, the one he had left in the man's eye. Aizawa's world seemed to tilt, his head spinning as he tried to make sense of everything. The guard must have ripped it out of his own eye to use as a weapon. He managed to slash Aizawa pretty deeply before jamming the blade into Aizawa's exposed frame. His shirt was soaked with blood, dripping off of him and onto the stone floor. Too much blood. He was losing too much blood. Izuku was saying something, but Aizawa couldn't hear. Everything was getting darker, his eyes closing against his command. Falling. He was falling. It was Izuku's fault. He shouldn't have let his guard down. He shouldn't have distracted Aizawa. One second, he was dodging guard number two's bait-in, and the next the man had pulled out a lighter and Izuku froze. He froze, just for a second too long. He should have used the erasure, should have taken the guard out before it got to this point. But he didn't, and Aizawa had to save him, and it was all his fault. After Aizawa tased guard number two, Izuku had taken the man's belt containing his bait-in, lighter, and walkie-talkie, trying not to pass out from the pain of his injuries. Aizawa had knocked out the other guard, thank God, and Izuku dragged himself towards his hero, his legs buckling with every step when he saw it. The blade, Aizawa's broken wrist, his mangled leg, all the blood, so much blood. Izuku barely had the time to process what he was seeing before he was lurching forward, running the short distance between them to catch Aizawa as he collapsed to the ground. The man turned his head weakly to look at Izuku. His gaze was cloudy, unfocused. "Zawa! Damn it, Zawa!" His voice could barely be heard over the alarms that were still blaring. He couldn't breathe, his throat closing in panic, his heart pounding against his chest. Izuku's eyes stung, and he couldn't tell if it was from quirk use or crying. "Leave. Run." Aizawa coughed. His speech slurred. He tried to push Izuku away, tried to remove Izuku's hands from his shoulder, but Izuku just held on tighter. "Fuck! Just shut up! Don't you fucking dare! I'm not leaving you!" Izuku grit his teeth, taking as deep of a breath as he could before jumping into action. He wasn't going to let it end like this. Not like this. Izuku tried to remember all of the HeroTube videos he'd watched on first aid growing up. All of the times he had to bandage his own wounds or dress his own burns. He could do this. He had to do this. Setting Aizawa gently down on the ground, Izuku rushed over to the guard that Aizawa had stabbed. He wrestled the jacket that the man had been wearing off of his huge figure, quick to rip the light material into manageable strips. Moving swiftly back over to Aizawa, Izuku worked with shaking hands to remove the scalpel from the wound and tied the jacket strips that pulled strips around the man's stomach in large sheaths. He knew that pulling the scalpel out wasn't ideal. In every medical textbook he'd ever read, the general conscience was, do not pull out the object when stabbed. But he couldn't carry Aizawa like that. Couldn't risk the scalpel damaging his organs even more. So this was the next best solution, he hoped. Izuku pulled the makeshift bandage taut, drawing a wince out of the semi-unconscious Aizawa. He bit back an apology. Now wasn't the time. After ensuring that the wound was dressed as well as it could be given the current circumstances, Izuku turned his attention to Aizawa himself. The man's eye was lidded and hazy, but still open. Good. He moved Aizawa into a sitting position, face to face with him now. "Zawa, I need you to stay awake from me. Can you do that? For me?" Izuku fought to keep the tremble out of his voice. It was a losing battle. Aizawa grunted as a response, his fingers twitching against Izuku's shirt. It was good enough. It had to be good enough. Okay, I'm going to help you stand now, okay? We're going to the garage and we're going to make it out, okay?" Another grunt. Desperation made itself known in the twisting of Izuku's stomach, the pounding of his heart echoing through the burns on his figure. Reinforcements were sure to be sweeping the building right now. It was only a matter of time before they caught them. He needed to move, and fast. Mustering up the strength he had left, Izuku heaved Aizawa upwards, stumbling to support the weight of the man. Luckily, Aizawa wasn't very heavy. Otherwise, this would have been impossible. Taking a deep breath to calm his nerves and focus his racing mind, Izuku wrapped one hand carefully around the hero's waist, avoiding the wound as best as possible, and used the other hand to support Aizawa's shoulder. Aizawa was leaning against Izuku's left side now, practically being carried by him in his injured state. Aizawa tried to drag himself forward, his feet scraping against the ground. Izuku carried on, shouldering Aizawa's weight, and half shuffled, half walked down the hall. Slowly, far too slowly, the pair made their way into the direction of the garage, Several times, Izuku could hear the sound of pounding footsteps somewhere in the facility, terror eating away at his insides as he ducked against the wall, praying that they would pass. Please just pass. And by some miracle, they did. Sweat and blood were caked against Izuku's skin, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he practically dragged Aizawa forward as fast as he could possibly move. It seemed like an eternity later when Izuku and Aizawa finally made it to their destination, both on the verge of collapsing. The garage was, well, a garage. A big one at that. Concrete walls and floors that echoed every sound made, full of various tools and trinkets. It was surprisingly normal for such a messed up facility. Inside the garage sat several armored jeeps, illuminated faintly by the dim glow of the overhead lights. The sight of actual vehicles made Izuku's heart soar. He was quick to maneuver Aizawa and himself into the garage, letting the door separating them from the facilities fall closed with a quiet click. The alarm blaring in the facility was quieter out here, muffled and almost inaudible. But they weren't out of the woods yet. He still had to get Aizawa to safety. Izuku's eyes searched the room for anything he could use to hotwire one of the cars. He never officially hot-wired a car before, but he'd read lots of books and watched a dozen videos on the subject. He was confident he could make it work. As he looked around, his eyes stopped on the wall to his left. Hanging on hooks were several sets of car keys, each numbered and neatly placed. Izuku swallowed his shock, hope blooming in his chest at the sight. He shuffled over to the cue ball, still supporting Aizawa, and grabbed the key ring with the number 1 on it. Upon closer inspection, the smooth concrete floor was marked with white paint where each car sat, corresponding numbers labeling the vehicles. It was oddly well organized, but Izuku wasn't going to dwell on that. Car number 1 was closest to the pair, and gave a little chirp when Izuku clicked the unlock button on the key ring. Izuku and Aizawa made their way over to the back of the car, which Izuku opened quickly before helping Aizawa lay down on the leather-clad seats, his heart clenching as the man groaned in pain. He needed to get him help. He was going to get him help. Shutting the door firmly, Izuku was about to hop into the driver's seat when something caught his eye. Sitting on the floor in the corner of the garage were several gallons of gasoline, glinting innocently under the overhead lights. The guard's lighter was still in the too big belt hanging loosely around his waist. Izuku made a split-second decision. He couldn't bring himself to regret it. Driving furiously away from the facility at a breakneck speed, barely able to reach the gas pedal before the seat was so far back, Izuku could hear the faint boom of cars exploding in the distance. He was terrified. He was tired. His body hurt so horribly, and he was scared for Aizawa, still heavily wounded in the back seat. Izuku couldn't stop the tremor of his hands or the pounding of his head, and he didn't know where he was going or if he was out of the clear yet. But as he watched the facility rise up in flames, growing ever smaller in the rearview mirror, he couldn't stop the feral grin that spread across his face at the sight. "What do you mean, gone?" Overhaul gripped the phone tightly, ignoring the hairline fractures that were beginning to appear on the screen. He couldn't continue his fury even if he tried to at this point. He couldn't contain his fury even if he tried to at this point. Well, sir, they seem to have escaped. It looks like..." A faint explosion could be heard on the line, followed by an unintelligible screaming. The phone call ended. Overhaul let his eyes fall shut. He took a deep breath. In, out. In, out. He opened his eyes, fury only temporarily sated. He had a child to find after all. Alright, everyone, that is the end of chapters 12 and 11 of Your Presence is a Dream in this Godforsaken Nightmare. I am so sorry about the audio and all the things that happened. This video was literally a wreck, but yeah, I had an emotional day and shit hit the fan. Anyways, sorry for all the stuttering and having to repeat myself. I'm sorry that the screen changed a few times. I have to use my phone to scroll through the fic, and the computer is like my microphone, and so sometimes I since I read fics on my computer so much, sometimes I accidentally use the arrows, and yeah, the screens change. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm so sorry for the delay on part 5. Have a fantastic day, and make sure you, oh my god, drink water. Yeah, drink water. Coffee is a good choice too, but you know, water's important enough. But you can drink coffee too. You don't need to drink water, but like still drink water. Anyways, have a fantastic day, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I didn't, because I feel like I totally butchered that for you guys. Anyways, have a fantastic day.